Elizabeth's maids undressed her corpse and froze in horror. What they found between her legs shouldn't have existed on any woman. 3 doctors who saw it were dead within a year. By the end of this video, you'll discover the genetic detail that made England's greatest queen genetically closer to a king. Within minutes of Elizabeth I drawing her final breath at Richmond Palace on March 24, 1603, armed guards materialized in the corridors like phantoms, sealing every entrance to her death chamber with drawn swords and expressions carved from stone. This wasn't the normal procedure for royal deaths. When Henry VIII died 56 years earlier, courtiers had flooded his chambers to witness history unfolding, nobles jostling for position to see the great king in his final state. And when Mary I passed just 45 years before, the court gathered freely to pay respects and observe the transition of power. But Elizabeth's room became something else entirely. A fortress locked down with a speed and severity that sent tremors of fear rippling through everyone present at Richmond that night. High-ranking nobles who had served the Queen faithfully for decades, men who had advised her through wars and diplomatic crises, who had stood beside her during the threat of the Spanish Armada, suddenly found themselves physically barred from entry by guards who wouldn't meet their eyes. Their protests were met with steel and silence. Their demands for explanation ignored completely, their attempts to invoke their rank and privilege crushed by orders that clearly came from the very top of the power structure. Something was catastrophically wrong, and the counselors orchestrating this unprecedented lockdown knew exactly what they were protecting, what they were hiding, what they were desperately trying to contain before it escaped into the world and destroyed everything Elizabeth had built. Inside that sealed chamber, only a handful of hand-picked ladies-in-waiting remained. Women who had dressed Elizabeth daily, who had bathed her aging body, who had managed her most intimate physical needs and kept her deepest secrets for years without ever breathing a word to outsiders. The air inside that room was thick with something far beyond grief. It was terror, raw and suffocating, the kind that settles into your bones when you know you're about to witness something that will haunt you forever, something that can never be unseen or forgotten. The counselors standing guard outside that locked door gave these remaining maids one explicit, chilling command that would echo in their minds for the rest of their lives. Prepare the body for burial, but speak of nothing you see, nothing you discover, nothing that happens in this room tonight. That emphasis on nothing wasn't casual or merely cautious. It dripped with unmistakable threat, loaded with the full weight of treason law that everyone in Tudor England understood with crystal clarity. Treason meant the executioner's block. It meant a brutal public death designed to terrify observers. It meant your family's name destroyed forever, your children marked as traitors' offspring, your property seized, your entire lineage erased from respectability for generations. One of the senior ladies-in-waiting would later record in her private papers, written decades after when she was an old woman still looking over her shoulder, that the counselors' faces that night were grave beyond any measure she had ever witnessed, their voices carrying an edge of desperate fear she had never heard before. Not even during the most dangerous moments of Elizabeth's 44-year reign, when Catholic assassins plotted and Spanish invasion fleets threatened. They weren't mourning their queen in that moment. Anyone could see that clearly. They were protecting something, guarding a secret so explosive that its revelation could shatter the carefully constructed legitimacy of the entire Tudor dynasty and plunge England into chaos. The maids exchanged glances in the candlelight, confusion mixing with the first cold stirrings of dread, questions forming silently that none dared voice aloud. Why such extreme secrecy for a simple burial preparation? What could possibly be so dangerous, so catastrophically threatening about preparing a queen's body for its final rest? Royal deaths had established rituals refined over centuries, procedures that everyone knew and followed. But this felt fundamentally different. This felt like a cover-up being orchestrated in real time, with the queen's body still warm on the bed. Her final breath barely faded from the air. As the counselors retreated to guard the doors from the outside, positioning themselves to control who could enter or leave, the ladies-in-waiting approached Elizabeth's corpse with hands that trembled despite their experience. They had performed this solemn duty before for other nobles and lesser royals, had washed bodies and prepared them for burial, knew what to expect from death in its various forms, or at least they thought they did until this moment. Elizabeth lay on her massive bed, still dressed in the elaborate gowns she had refused to remove, even in her final weeks of illness when she could barely stand. When her strength had faded and her breath grew labored, she had insisted on remaining fully dressed, fully armored in her costume until the very end. Layer upon layer of silk, velvet, and intricate embroidery covered her like the armor it truly was. Protection she had worn against the world for 4 decades of rule. As they began to undress their queen for the final time, each woman felt the weight of understanding that they were peeling away more than just clothing and fabric. They were dismantling a carefully constructed image, revealing whatever truth Elizabeth had spent her entire reign hiding with obsessive, desperate care. The oppressive silence pressed down on them, broken only by the rustle of fabric and their own shallow breathing, each woman acutely aware that one wrong word, one slip of the tongue about what they might discover here, and they would face the same fate as traitors who had plotted against the crown. But curiosity warred with fear in their minds. What secret could be so catastrophic that it required armed guards, explicit death threats, and this suffocating blanket of enforced silence? As they removed the first layer of Elizabeth's outer gown, working carefully around her stiff limbs, none of them had any idea they were about to witness something so shocking that the British establishment would spend the next 400 years making sure it stayed buried, hidden, erased from history. What they were about to discover wasn't just concealed beneath royal robes. It was hidden beneath the very foundation of Tudor legitimacy itself. To understand what those terrified maids discovered in that death chamber, you need to understand a rare genetic condition that wouldn't have a medical name for another 350 years. A condition so unusual that even today most people have never heard of it. Modern medical science calls it Androgen Insensitivity Syndrome, or AIS, and it represents one of the most fascinating intersections of genetics and physical development that human biology can produce. Here's how it works, explained in terms that would have been impossible for Tudor physicians to comprehend. During normal human development, a person with XY chromosomes, the genetic combination typically associated with male development, will develop male physical characteristics during fetal growth and puberty because their body responds to testosterone and other androgens that flood their system. These hormones trigger the formation of male reproductive anatomy, male secondary sex characteristics like facial hair and muscle development, deeper voice, masculine bone structure, all the features we associate with biological males. But in individuals with complete androgen insensitivity syndrome, something fundamentally different occurs at the cellular level, something that changes everything. These individuals are born with XY chromosomes in every cell of their body. The genetic blueprint for male development is present and active, but their bodies completely lack the ability to respond to testosterone no matter how much is produced. The hormone circulates through their bloodstream normally, their testes produce it in typical male quantities, but their cells don't have the receptors necessary to detect it or use it for development. It's as if their body is deaf to the chemical signals that should trigger masculinization, blind to the hormonal instructions that should create male anatomy. As a result, their bodies develop along entirely female lines instead of male lines during fetal growth, following the default developmental pathway that human fetuses take when androgen signaling is absent. The result is striking and medically fascinating. People with complete AIS appear entirely female externally, with anatomy and physical features that would be completely indistinguishable from any other woman to casual observers, intimate partners, or even most medical examinations in eras before modern genetic testing. Individuals with complete androgen insensitivity syndrome develop breasts at puberty just like other women, because breast development is triggered by estrogen, which their bodies produce and respond to normally. In fact, women with AIS often develop particularly prominent breasts because the testosterone their testes produce gets converted to estrogen by their body. And without androgen receptors to create balancing masculine features, the estrogenic effects are unopposed and pronounced. They have female body shape and proportions. Their external genitalia look typically female in every observable way. Their faces and features develop along feminine lines, and to anyone seeing them clothed or even naked in most circumstances, they would simply appear to be women. Nothing unusual, nothing to question, nothing that would raise suspicion or concern in an era before genetic testing and chromosomal analysis. But internally, their anatomy tells a profoundly different story that becomes apparent only during medical examination, or, as in Elizabeth's case, during burial preparation when every layer is stripped away. People with complete AIS lack all the organs necessary for female reproduction. They have no uterus where a fetus could develop, no ovaries to produce eggs or regulate monthly hormonal cycles, no fallopian tubes to transport eggs, none of the internal female reproductive anatomy that would be necessary for menstruation or pregnancy or childbirth. Instead, they typically have undescended or partially descended testes, which remain hidden in their abdominal cavity or inguinal canals, producing testosterone that their body cannot use, creating a biological paradox. They also have a shortened vagina that ends blindly without connecting to any internal reproductive organs. A vaginal canal that appears normal from the outside but leads nowhere, connecting to nothing, serving no reproductive function. This combination of external female appearance with internal male genetics and mixed anatomical features creates someone who exists in a biological category that Tudor England had no framework to understand, no language to describe, no cultural or medical context to explain. In the 16th century, before genetics was understood, before hormones were discovered, before the mechanisms of sexual development were mapped, someone with AIS would simply be an inexplicable mystery. A person whose body violated all the rules that people thought they understood about male and female, man and woman. The physical characteristics commonly associated with Androgen Insensitivity Syndrome match the documented observations about Elizabeth I with remarkable, disturbing precision that becomes impossible to dismiss as coincidence when you line them up side by side. Individuals with complete AIS are typically significantly taller than average women because they benefit from some of the growth effects of XY chromosomes, particularly the influence on bone length and overall stature, without the masculinizing effects of testosterone on body shape and muscle development that would make them appear male. Elizabeth was notably, remarkably tall for her era, standing above many of the men at her court, a fact that multiple contemporary sources confirm repeatedly and that seemed unusual enough to comment on in an age when women were typically shorter than men, and queens were expected to be delicate, petite figures. People with AIS often develop deeper, louder voices than typical women because of subtle effects on vocal cord development and larynx structure related to their XY chromosome makeup and growth patterns. Not male voices exactly, but voices that don't quite fit the feminine range. Voices that carry unusual power and resonance. This matches exactly what multiple ambassadors independently noted about Elizabeth throughout her 44-year reign. That her voice was unusually loud, that her manner of speaking had a masculine quality that confused trained observers who had heard hundreds of royal women speak. Individuals with AIS tend to have more athletic or angular builds, rather than the soft curves typically associated with female physical development. With longer limbs, broader shoulders relative to hips, more defined musculature when exercised. Not masculine bodies exactly, but bodies that don't quite conform to typical female proportions. This explains the repeated observations about Elizabeth's masculine bearing, her soldier stride that multiple diplomats noted with confusion, her physical strength that seemed excessive even for a healthy woman and completely inconsistent with someone who spent most of her time in sedentary court life. Women with AIS typically have very little body hair compared to other women. Minimal pubic hair, sparse or absent armpit hair, little body hair anywhere, which would have been nearly impossible for outside observers to notice in an era of elaborate clothing, but which matches the few intimate descriptions that survived from Elizabeth's ladies-in-waiting, who made vague, coded references in their private papers to the Queen's unusual lack of body hair. But most significantly for understanding Elizabeth's lifelong refusal to marry, individuals with complete androgen insensitivity syndrome do not and cannot menstruate because they lack the internal reproductive organs necessary for a menstrual cycle. They have no uterus to shed lining monthly, no ovaries to trigger hormonal cycles, no capacity for pregnancy or childbirth whatsoever, no possibility of ever producing an heir no matter how many times they might attempt conception. The pressure on Elizabeth to marry wasn't merely social expectation or political custom. It was relentless, constant, overwhelming force applied from every direction throughout her entire 44-year reign, with increasing desperation as she aged. She was the most eligible woman in all of Europe, actively and aggressively pursued by kings, princes, archdukes, and dukes from every major power on the continent, who saw marriage to England's queen as the ultimate diplomatic prize. Philip II of Spain proposed marriage to her immediately after her sister Mary's death, hoping to maintain Spanish influence over England and bring the nation back into the Catholic fold. Archduke Charles of Austria, representing the powerful Habsburg dynasty, pursued her for years through intermediaries and ambassadors. The Duke of Anjou, brother to the French king, courted her extensively in a match that would have allied England with France against Spanish power. King Eric XIV of Sweden sent proposals. Various German Protestant princes offered themselves as potential consorts. The list of suitors stretched across decades, across the map of Europe. each proposal bringing new diplomatic opportunities, new political calculations, new pressure to finally choose a husband and secure the succession. Her own counselors, the men she trusted most in the world, begged her constantly, desperately to select a husband and produce an heir to secure the Tudor line and prevent the chaos that would inevitably follow her death. William Cecil, her closest advisor and the brilliant administrator who managed England's government for decades, wrote numerous formal memoranda pleading with her to marry before it was too late, warning in increasingly urgent terms of the catastrophe that would follow her death without clear succession. He understood better than anyone that England's stability, its religious settlement, its independence from foreign domination, all hung by the single thread of Elizabeth's life. Parliament formally petitioned her multiple times over the course of her reign to choose a consort, with representatives making impassioned speeches about her duty to the nation, her obligation to provide heirs, the dangerous instability of having no designated successor as she aged into her 30s, 40s, 50s. The political stakes literally could not have been higher. Without a clear succession plan, the country faced the absolute certainty of civil war and foreign invasion the moment Elizabeth died. Catholics would rally behind Mary, Queen of Scots, and her Catholic son, James, demanding a return to the old faith. Protestants would support other candidates, perhaps distant Tudor relatives, or even completely new dynasties. Spain would see an opportunity to invade and install a Catholic monarch. France might intervene to prevent Spanish dominance. The carefully maintained religious peace that Elizabeth had negotiated would explode into sectarian violence. English independence, won at such cost from papal authority and Spanish influence, would be threatened. Everyone could see this disaster approaching like a slow-motion catastrophe, building momentum with each year that Elizabeth remained unmarried and childless. Yet she always had excuses ready when the pressure became too intense, and she deployed them with practiced skill born of decades of necessity. The timing wasn't right yet for this particular alliance because of ongoing diplomatic tensions. This specific candidate wasn't suitable for various complex political reasons she would explain at length. She needed more time to properly consider England's interests and couldn't be rushed into such a momentous decision. She would make her choice soon, she promised repeatedly. Always soon, never now. Perpetually delaying, constantly deflecting, endlessly temporizing. For 44 years, she played this exhausting game, turning aside every proposal, avoiding every commitment, promising without ever delivering, keeping Europe's most powerful men dangling on the hope that they might still win her hand. Historians have proposed numerous elaborate explanations over the centuries for her stubborn, seemingly irrational refusal to marry despite the overwhelming pressure and obvious political necessity. Perhaps she was psychologically traumatized by watching her father Henry VIII cycle through 6 wives with terrifying unpredictability. 2 of them executed on his direct orders, including her own mother Anne Boleyn. Perhaps seeing her mother beheaded when she was just 3 years old created such deep psychological damage that she could never trust marriage. Perhaps she enjoyed the political power that came with remaining single and perpetually available. The way her constant eligibility gave her leverage in diplomatic negotiations with every major European power simultaneously. Married queens became extensions of their husband's power, but unmarried Elizabeth remained England's sole sovereign. Perhaps she was engaged in an elaborate, calculated game of playing suitors against each other, using the possibility of marriage as a perpetual bargaining chip, while never intending to actually follow through with any proposal. Keeping everyone hopeful kept everyone friendly, kept alliances fluid, kept England's options open. Perhaps she genuinely loved Robert Dudley, her childhood friend and lifelong favorite, but couldn't marry him because of the scandal surrounding his wife's mysterious death. And having lost the one man she truly wanted, she chose to marry no one. Each of these theories has been argued extensively in academic journals and historical texts. Each has supporting evidence in letters and diplomatic reports. Each attempts to make psychological or political sense of behavior that seemed fundamentally irrational from the outside. But what if the truth was simpler and far more tragic than any of these elaborate psychological or political theories that historians have constructed over centuries of speculation? What if Elizabeth physically could not marry because any husband would have discovered her secret on the wedding night when privacy and intimacy made concealment impossible? Think about what Tudor marriages meant for royalty. They weren't merely political arrangements sealed with signatures and ceremonies. They required physical consummation. They required the bride and groom to share a bed, to remove their clothing, to engage in intimate relations that would produce heirs. The wedding night was the moment when all disguises fell away, when all the elaborate costumes and makeup and public performances meant nothing, when two bodies came together in absolute vulnerability. Any prince who married Elizabeth would have expected to consummate the marriage immediately, would have expected to find typical female anatomy, would have expected everything to be as it should be for a woman who could bear children and continue royal bloodlines. Instead, he would have discovered something profoundly wrong: the absence of expected anatomy, the presence of unexpected features, the biological reality that made pregnancy impossible. The shock, the confusion, the inevitable questions would have destroyed everything in an instant. The prince would have called for physicians to examine this mystery. The physicians would have confirmed that something was fundamentally abnormal, that this was not merely unusual variation, but something that violated all their understanding of female bodies. Word would have spread despite all attempts at secrecy. Too many people would have been involved, too many witnesses to the discovery, too many physicians and counselors and ambassadors who needed to know what had happened and why the marriage remained unconsummated. Within days, every court in Europe would have heard that England's queen was physically abnormal, anatomically wrong, biologically unsuited for marriage and childbearing. The Catholic powers who had always disputed Elizabeth's right to rule would seize on this revelation as proof that God himself had cursed her, had marked her body as unfit for sovereignty, had demonstrated through her very anatomy that her reign was illegitimate. Spain would invade with renewed religious justification. This wasn't merely politics now, this was divine judgment made visible in flesh. Internal rebellion would explode across England as Catholics and Protestant extremists alike questioned whether someone with such a body had any right to sit on the throne. Elizabeth would likely have faced immediate deposition, possibly execution for deceiving the nation and her suitors, certainly imprisonment and the destruction of everything she had built. Marriage wasn't a choice she was refusing out of stubbornness or psychology. It was a death sentence she was desperately, constantly avoiding through decades of careful political maneuvering. The evidence that something was unusual about Elizabeth's physical form didn't suddenly appear when she died in 1603. It had been accumulating for decades in the confused, frustrated, increasingly disturbed reports of foreign ambassadors and diplomats who came to her court and left troubled by what they had observed. These men weren't casual observers spreading idle gossip or politically motivated enemies inventing slander to damage her reputation. They were highly trained professional intelligence agents sent to Elizabeth's court by their home governments with one crystal-clear primary mission: study the Queen in exhaustive detail and report everything back with absolute accuracy. In the cutthroat world of 16th century European politics, where information was power and kingdoms rose or fell based on accurate intelligence, these ambassadors needed to provide precise, reliable observations about potential marriage partners and political rivals. Kings and princes required detailed knowledge about whether a queen was healthy enough to bear children and provide heirs, whether she showed early signs of illness or physical weakness that might affect her longevity and political stability, how she carried herself in both carefully staged public ceremonies and more revealing private audiences, whether her appearance matched her age, whether her demeanor suggested strength or vulnerability. The ambassadors who came to Elizabeth's court over the decades of her reign had spent years learning how to assess physical characteristics with trained precision, how to read body language for signs of deception or hidden illness, how to spot subtle indicators of disease or abnormality that might affect complex diplomatic calculations about marriage alliances and political partnerships. These were professionals who had observed hundreds of royal women across every court in Europe throughout their long careers. They had studied queens and princesses from Spain to Sweden, from France to Poland, had developed expert eyes for what royal women looked like, how they moved, spoke, and carried themselves in the rigidly controlled environment of court life. Their observations weren't subjective impressions colored by personal bias or politically motivated attacks designed to damage Elizabeth's reputation for strategic reasons. They were professional assessments based on extensive experience, careful training, and the understanding that their careers and their nation's diplomatic success depended on accuracy, which makes their reports about Elizabeth I so deeply disturbing, because multiple ambassadors from different countries, working independently with no coordination or communication between them, no opportunity to compare notes or influence each other's observations, all noted that something was distinctly unusual about the English Queen, something they couldn't quite define in precise terms, but also couldn't ignore or dismiss as insignificant. The Venetian ambassador, representing one of Europe's most sophisticated and experienced diplomatic services, wrote in his official dispatches, sent through encrypted channels back to Venice, that Elizabeth possessed what he carefully described as a very loud voice, and a masculine manner of speaking that seemed inconsistent with her status as a queen and her presentation as a delicate royal lady. This wasn't commentary on her political assertiveness or her strong personality in wielding power. He was describing her actual voice, its pitch, its volume, its quality, the physical sound that came from her throat when she spoke, and his confusion was evident in the careful phrasing. Another diplomat from a completely different country, working years later with no access to the Venetian reports, described her as having more the bearing of a soldier than a lady, noting that the way she walked and stood and carried herself in less formal moments seemed fundamentally wrong for a woman of her status and upbringing, as if she had been trained in military camps rather than royal chambers. These weren't insults designed to undermine her. They were confused observations from trained experts who genuinely couldn't make sense of what they were seeing with their own experienced eyes. They had come to England expecting to meet and evaluate a typical royal woman, someone who would fit comfortably into the mental categories and expectations they had developed through years of observing European nobility, and instead they found someone who didn't quite fit any category they knew, someone who violated subtle rules they hadn't even consciously articulated. But the most disturbing report, the one that suggests these diplomats were observing something genuinely unusual rather than merely being confused by Elizabeth's strong personality, came from a Spanish envoy whose career was effectively destroyed by a single sentence he wrote in what he thought was secure communication. This particular diplomat had served as a professional observer for Spanish intelligence for many years, had studied dozens of European royals with careful attention, had written countless reports that were valued by his superiors for their accuracy, insight, and reliable judgment. He was trusted, experienced, deeply careful with his words because he understood the political weight they carried. In a dispatch to the Spanish court sent through the most heavily encrypted channels reserved for only the most sensitive intelligence that could affect Spain's strategic calculations, he wrote 7 simple words that got him immediately recalled to Madrid in disgrace and effectively ended his promising diplomatic career. "Her Majesty's form is not as other women's." That's all he said. 7 words, carefully chosen, deliberately vague enough to avoid giving explicit details that might be intercepted and understood by English spies. He never got the opportunity to explain what he meant or elaborate on his shocking observation in more explicit terms because he was pulled out of England within days of the dispatch arriving in Spain, summoned home with unusual speed that suggested panic in the Spanish court. His diplomatic career ended abruptly and completely. He never received another posting, never returned to intelligence work, simply disappeared from the historical record, and the report itself was buried deep in Spanish archives, where it sat undiscovered for centuries until modern historians finally found it and realized its explosive implications. What exactly did this trained, careful observer see that was so shocking it ended his career and caused such panic among Spanish officials who read his report? The phrasing he chose is deliberately vague, selected with the caution of someone who knew his dispatches might be intercepted by English intelligence and needed to avoid explicit statements, yet it's unmistakably significant in its implications. It suggests something visually apparent, something that didn't match what an experienced diplomat expected to see when observing a royal woman, something wrong enough to be worth reporting, despite the personal risk. And he wasn't alone in his confusion. Other ambassadors from the same era, working for different governments, echoed similar observations using different careful words, all of them struggling to communicate something they saw but couldn't quite explain within the medical and cultural framework available to 16th century observers. Multiple diplomatic reports from various countries described Elizabeth's hands as surprisingly large and powerful for a woman's hands, with long fingers and prominent knuckles that seemed more suitable for a man's hand than a queen's delicate appendage. Hands that could grip iron pokers and bend them, hands that didn't fit Tudor expectations of feminine delicacy. They noted repeatedly that she walked with what they called a soldier stride, taking long, confident steps rather than the graceful glide expected of noble ladies who were trained from childhood to move in a specific feminine way that signaled their status and gentility. Several observers commented extensively on her physical strength, which seemed excessive even for a healthy, vigorous woman, let alone someone who spent most of her time in relatively sedentary court life, attending to paperwork and diplomatic audiences. One French diplomat recorded in his private journal watching Elizabeth grip and bend a thick iron poker with her bare hands during a moment of political frustration, displaying a level of upper body strength that genuinely shocked him because he had never seen any woman, royal or common, perform such a feat. The people who got close enough to Elizabeth's body to witness what was really hidden beneath the gowns and makeup had reactions that were far more extreme than the mere confusion and puzzled observations of those distant ambassadors who only ever saw her at formal ceremonies. They didn't write carefully worded diplomatic dispatches or vague expressions of confusion. They were struck absolutely dumb with shock, horror, and terror. And if they tried to talk about it afterward, to share what they had witnessed with anyone else, to make sense of the inexplicable thing they had seen, they often ended up dead under suspicious circumstances. This brings us to 1566, nearly 40 years before Elizabeth's death, when a medical crisis forced the Queen to grant unprecedented access to her body. Access that resulted in one of the most disturbing reactions ever recorded by a physician examining a royal patient. What happened in Elizabeth's private chambers during that examination would haunt the doctor who witnessed it for the rest of his very short life. In 1566, Elizabeth I fell so violently, catastrophically ill that everyone at court believed with genuine terror that they were watching their queen die in real time, possibly within days or even hours. The illness struck suddenly without any warning signs, transforming the vigorous 43-year-old monarch who had been dancing and hunting just days before into a suffering invalid within what seemed like hours. She developed a high fever that raged uncontrollably despite every treatment her team of royal physicians tried. Bloodletting to balance her humors, purging to clear supposed toxins, herbal concoctions prepared from expensive imported ingredients, prayers offered by court chaplains. The fever burned so intensely hot that her bedding and nightclothes had to be changed repeatedly throughout the day and night as sweat soaked through everything, leaving her shaking and delirious. Most alarmingly for the physicians trying to diagnose and treat this mysterious condition, she experienced pain so severe in her abdomen and lower body that she couldn't stand upright or walk more than a few steps without multiple strong attendants supporting her full weight. For nearly a week, Elizabeth lay in her private chambers, writhing in pain, while her counselors gathered in antechambers and corridors outside, speaking in hushed, terrified voices about succession, about what would happen when, not if, but when, their queen died without an heir or even a designated successor. The political situation was absolutely desperate in a way that's hard for modern people to fully grasp. Elizabeth had no children, had never designated an heir despite decades of pressure, had no clear plan for who would rule England after her death. If she died suddenly during this crisis without naming a successor, England would almost certainly descend into bloody civil war as various claimants fought for the throne with military force. Catholics would rally behind Mary Queen of Scots, Elizabeth's cousin who was currently imprisoned in England, but had a strong claim to the throne and the backing of Catholic powers across Europe. Protestants would support other candidates, perhaps distant Tudor relatives, or even members of completely new dynasties who could claim some connection to the English throne. Foreign powers would inevitably intervene militarily to support whichever faction served their strategic interests. Spain would send armies to back Catholic claimants. France might invade to prevent Spanish dominance. The Dutch and German Protestants would offer support to Protestant candidates. The country teetered on the absolute edge of chaos, and every hour that Elizabeth remained unconscious with fever brought England closer to catastrophic collapse. Elizabeth herself clearly believed death was imminent and unavoidable. She was so completely convinced she would not survive this mysterious crisis that she made a decision that would have caused immediate political catastrophe had she lived long enough for it to be implemented. She dictated orders, barely conscious and shaking with fever, to name Robert Dudley, her longtime favorite and rumored lover, as Lord Protector of England, with full authority to rule the kingdom until the succession could be properly determined through whatever political process emerged. This was an astonishing choice that her counselors recognized as disastrous. Dudley was hated by much of the nobility, suspected of murdering his wife years earlier to free himself for Elizabeth, seen as an upstart who had risen far above his proper station through the Queen's favoritism. In this desperate situation with their queen possibly dying, Elizabeth's physicians finally begged for permission to examine her properly, thoroughly, completely, something they had never been allowed to do before, not once in all the years they had served her and treated her various minor ailments. This was an extraordinary, almost unthinkable request that violated every protocol of royal dignity. Under normal circumstances in Tudor England, a thorough medical examination of the Queen's body would have been absolutely unthinkable. A violation of royal dignity so severe that no physician would dare even suggest it, no matter how medically necessary the examination might be for proper diagnosis. Touching the monarch's body was essentially forbidden except in the most superficial ways. You could check a pulse if absolutely necessary, examine the tongue if you must, ask questions about symptoms from a respectful distance. But you didn't undress a queen, you didn't look beneath the many layers of silk and velvet and carefully constructed royal image that separated monarchy from common humanity. Physicians typically diagnosed royal patients by observing symptoms from across the room, studying complexion and breathing patterns, checking pulse and tongue if they were extremely fortunate and the patient allowed such intimate contact, and asking carefully phrased questions about what the patient was experiencing internally. They made their diagnostic recommendations based on fragmentary, incomplete information and simply hoped for the best outcomes. But Elizabeth's illness in 1566 was so severe, so clearly life-threatening, and the political situation so catastrophically desperate that normal protocols were completely abandoned out of necessity. Elizabeth finally reluctantly granted her physicians permission to conduct a thorough examination of her body, but with one absolutely critical restriction that she insisted upon even in her fevered, weakened state. Only one doctor would be allowed to examine her in complete privacy, behind locked doors with no other witnesses present. Dr. Huick, her personal physician who had served her faithfully for many years and was trusted above all other medical professionals at court, would perform the examination alone. The other physicians who had been clamoring for access were dismissed and sent from the room without explanation. The ladies-in-waiting, who normally never left Elizabeth's presence, were ordered to leave and wait in outer chambers. Dr. Huick entered the Queen's private chamber alone, closed and locked the heavy door behind him, and disappeared from view. What happened during the next hour has haunted historians ever since, because the reaction of Dr. Huick upon finally emerging from that examination room was so extreme, so viscerally disturbed that it could not be hidden from the many witnesses waiting anxiously outside, desperately hoping for good news about their queen's condition and prognosis. For 44 years, Elizabeth I constructed and maintained one of history's most elaborate visual fortresses around a body that couldn't withstand close scrutiny. Every fashion choice, every cosmetic application, every carefully staged public appearance was strategic defense rather than royal vanity. The most visible and eventually most damaging element of her armor was the Venetian ceruse she applied to her face daily, sometimes multiple times per day, from her 20s until her death at age 69. This cosmetic paste, made from white lead ground fine and mixed with vinegar to create a smooth, paint-like consistency, was the height of Tudor fashion for wealthy women who could afford its expensive imported ingredients. It created the porcelain complexion that Tudor beauty standards demanded. Pale, smooth, flawless skin that signaled nobility, leisure, separation from common people who worked outdoors in the sun. Elizabeth applied this toxic mask with obsessive regularity, coating her entire face, neck, and visible chest in thick layers of white lead that dried to a smooth, artificial finish. But the cosmetic that preserved her public image was simultaneously destroying her face beneath. White lead is profoundly toxic, and applied daily for decades, it literally eats through human skin like acid, creating horrible lesions and permanent damage. As Elizabeth aged into her 40s, 50s, and 60s, she had to apply the ceruse thicker and thicker to hide the growing damage it was causing, creating a vicious cycle where the makeup that concealed her deteriorating face was also the cause of that deterioration. By the time she died, her face beneath the makeup was a landscape of black and red destruction, with deep craters where healthy tissue had been eaten away, wounds that oozed even after death. But nobody saw this horror while she lived because the makeup itself hid the damage it caused. Elizabeth also wore corsets cinched impossibly tight from her teenage years until her death, creating the fashionable small waist that Tudor gowns demanded, but also serving a more strategic purpose. The extreme compression changed the shape of her entire torso, disguising whatever natural body shape lay beneath, creating an artificial silhouette that met expectations of feminine form, regardless of what her actual anatomy looked like underneath. The boning was pulled so tight that it left permanent grooves carved into her flesh, visible channels where the whalebone stays pressed continuously against her skin for hours every day. Her ribs became visibly misshapen over the decades. Several of them cracked and healed improperly from the constant pressure that never released, creating a chest cavity that looked deformed by the time of her death. But again, nobody saw this while she lived because the corset that caused the damage also hid it completely. The massive gowns with their wide farthingales and elaborate padded sleeves served multiple defensive purposes simultaneously. They disguised her actual body shape completely, making it impossible for observers to determine anything about her natural proportions or physical structure. The heavy fabrics and multiple layers prevented anyone from accidentally seeing or touching her body through her clothing. The elaborate embroidery and jewels drew attention upward toward her face and away from her body. The enormous sleeves hid her large, powerful hands that multiple ambassadors had noted with confusion. The wide skirts made her walk differently, forcing a gliding motion that concealed her natural soldier stride that observers found so masculine. Every element of Tudor fashion that Elizabeth embraced so enthusiastically wasn't merely following trends. It was carefully chosen strategic armor that controlled what people could see and prevented them from seeing what she desperately needed to hide. She also wore elaborate wigs covered in jewels and decorations that drew the eye upward, away from her body, and toward her face where she could control the image through makeup and expression. The wigs got larger and more elaborate as she aged, towering structures decorated with pearls and gold wire and precious stones that became almost absurd in their size, but served the crucial purpose of dominating visual attention. In her public appearances, Elizabeth was never casually positioned or randomly lit. Every ceremony, every diplomatic audience, every public procession was carefully choreographed, with her placement calculated to control exactly what observers could see and from what angles and distances. She appeared on raised platforms that put her above eye level. She positioned herself with light sources behind her, so her face was shadowed and details were obscured. She maintained specific distances from observers that allowed them to see her costume and general impression, but prevented detailed examination of features. She moved through crowds quickly, never lingering long enough for extended observation, never allowing anyone to study her carefully for more than brief moments. The ambassadors who wrote those confused reports about her masculine voice and unusual bearing were only ever observing Elizabeth from careful distance at formal ceremonies and diplomatic audiences, where elaborate costumes and careful staging controlled exactly what they could see and for how long. The massive gowns with their wide farthingales and padded structures disguised her body's actual shape completely. The thick layers of ceruse makeup covered every inch of visible skin, creating an artificial complexion that hid whatever lay beneath. The wigs and jeweled headpieces drew attention away from other potentially revealing features and dominated the visual field. The carefully choreographed public appearances meant she was always positioned just right, always lit to obscure rather than reveal, always presented in ways that minimized scrutiny of her actual physical form beneath all the constructed artifice. The ambassadors noted oddities: the voice that seemed too deep and loud, the hands that seemed too large and powerful, the walk that seemed too masculine when glimpsed between the formal glides. But these were surface observations, tantalizing fragments that hinted at something deeper, without ever revealing the full picture that lay hidden beneath all those defensive layers. The people who got close enough to witness what was really beneath the gowns and makeup, who saw her actual body stripped of all the protective artifice she had spent decades perfecting, had reactions that were far more extreme than mere diplomatic confusion. They were struck dumb with shock and horror, left shaking and pale, haunted by what they had witnessed. And if they tried to talk about it afterward, tried to share the inexplicable thing they had seen with anyone else who might help them make sense of it, they often ended up dead under convenient circumstances within months, or sometimes just weeks. Dr. Huick's reaction when he emerged from examining Elizabeth during her 1566 medical crisis tells us everything we need to know about what lay beneath all that armor. When the door finally opened, and the physician emerged after that hour of private examination, the courtiers and counselors who had been pacing nervously outside immediately rushed toward him, desperate for information about the Queen's condition. But they stopped short, frozen by what they saw in his face. The systematic silencing of everyone who witnessed Elizabeth's anatomical secret wasn't passive or accidental. It was active, ruthless, coordinated suppression that suggests pre-planned protocols were already in place for exactly this scenario, ready to be activated the moment Elizabeth died and the truth became impossible to hide any longer. The young maid who vomited at the death chamber discovery, whose body physically rejected the horror her eyes had witnessed when she saw what lay between Elizabeth's legs, was removed from that locked room within minutes by guards who had clearly been waiting for exactly this kind of reaction. She wasn't simply dismissed from service or sent home to her family. She was escorted by armed men out of Richmond Palace before the sun rose, taken in a closed carriage through the night to a remote estate in a distant corner of England, where no one would know her or think to look for her. She was given a comfortable home, a generous lifetime pension that would ensure she never needed to work or rely on anyone else for support. and a very clear message delivered by men whose faces left no doubt they would carry out their threats. Speak one word about what you saw in that death chamber. Tell anyone anything about the Queen's body, and your comfort becomes execution. Your pension becomes prison. Your life ends on a scaffold with your family watching. This wasn't mercy or kindness. This was buying silence through a combination of comfort and terror, giving her every reason to keep quiet and every reason to fear what would happen if she didn't. She lived out her long life in that remote estate, never returning to London, never speaking about her years in royal service, taking her secret to the grave decades later. Dr. Huick, the Queen's personal physician who performed that fateful private examination during her 1566 illness and emerged looking like he had seen something that shook him to his core, was dead within exactly 1 year of that examination. Not immediately, which might have raised too many questions, but after a carefully calculated period that made the death seem less suspicious. The official cause recorded in the medical registers was sudden fever, a conveniently vague diagnosis in an era of limited medical understanding that could mean almost anything and prevented any further inquiry or investigation. Sudden fever explained nothing, implicated no one, raised no questions. It was the perfect cause of death for someone who needed to be silenced without creating scandal. More significantly and more suspiciously than the vague cause of death, Dr. Huick's medical notes and personal papers were never found after his death. Not by his family, who should have inherited them. Not by other physicians who would have valued them as professional resources. Not by historians searching through archives for centuries afterward. If he had written anything about what he observed during that unprecedented private examination of Elizabeth's body, anything that might explain his shocked reaction and subsequent disturbed silence, any clinical notes that might solve the mystery of what he saw in the Queen's private chamber that haunted him so profoundly it vanished completely. Some historians believe the papers were destroyed deliberately, either by Huick himself before his convenient death, perhaps understanding he was in danger and wanting to protect his family from any suspicion of possessing dangerous knowledge, or by agents of the Crown immediately after his death, moving quickly to seize and destroy any written evidence before it could be discovered by others. Other historians think the papers may still exist somewhere, buried deep in forgotten archives or private family collections, waiting to be discovered by some future researcher who will finally solve this 400-year-old mystery. But for over 4 centuries, despite extensive searching by countless historians, no trace of Dr. Huick's notes from that examination has ever surfaced. 2 other court physicians who served Elizabeth in her final years and who may have suspected something unusual about her anatomy, based on symptoms she displayed or treatments she required, also died of sudden fever within months of Elizabeth's death in 1603. Their deaths coming so close together and so soon after the Queen's passing that the pattern became impossible to ignore. 3 medical professionals who had varying degrees of knowledge about Elizabeth's body, who might have been able to explain or confirm what the maids discovered in the death chamber, all dead of the same vague diagnosis within a year of her death. This wasn't coincidence or bad luck. This was systematic elimination of witnesses who knew too much, who could corroborate the shocking discovery, who represented ongoing threats to the carefully constructed narrative of Elizabeth as a normal woman who simply chose not to marry. The senior ladies-in-waiting who helped prepare Elizabeth's body for burial, who saw firsthand what lay between her legs and understood immediately why this discovery had to be hidden, were sworn to absolute silence under the full weight of treason law, with explicit, detailed threats that left nothing to imagination. Treason in Tudor England wasn't merely execution, it was brutal, public, designed to terrify anyone who might consider similar betrayal. Men convicted of treason were hanged, drawn, and quartered, a horrific process where they were hanged until nearly dead, then cut down still alive, castrated, disemboweled while conscious, and finally beheaded and dismembered, their body parts displayed across the kingdom as warning. Women convicted of treason faced burning at the stake, tied to a wooden post while flames consumed them alive as crowds watched. Beyond the immediate horror of execution, treason conviction meant your entire family was destroyed, your property seized, your children marked as traitors' offspring and barred from inheritance or position, your name erased from respectability for generations. The counselors who gave orders in that death chamber made absolutely certain every surviving maid understood these consequences in visceral detail. Speak one word about the Queen's anatomy, tell anyone what you witnessed, write anything in letters or diaries, and you face the traitor's death while your family watches their lives destroyed. The Spanish diplomat whose career ended with 7 words, "Her Majesty's form is not as other women's," was recalled to Madrid so quickly after his dispatch arrived that he barely had time to pack his belongings before guards were escorting him to a ship bound for Spain. His promising diplomatic career ended instantly and completely. He never received another foreign posting, never returned to intelligence work, simply disappeared from the historical record as if he had never existed. The message to other ambassadors was crystal clear. Observe carefully, but some things should never be reported. Some observations should never be written down. Some truths are too dangerous to speak aloud. This pattern of silencing, through exile, through death, through threats, through destroyed careers, reveals the machinery of cover-up operating at the highest levels of Tudor power, coordinated and ruthless, suggesting that Elizabeth's counselors had planned for this exact scenario, had prepared protocols for containing the secret the moment Elizabeth died, and concealment became impossible. 421 years after those terrified maids wrapped Elizabeth's body in cerecloth and sealed her in a lead coffin, she still lies in Westminster Abbey beneath an elaborate monument, completely undisturbed in that same lead coffin that was soldered shut within hours of her death. Lead coffins, expensive and reserved for the most important burials, serve a crucial dual purpose that made them perfect for Elizabeth's situation. They protect contents from air and decay, preserving whatever lies inside remarkably well for centuries, while simultaneously making it nearly impossible to open again without massive effort, official sanction, and very public process that would draw attention and questions. Modern forensic science has proven that human remains sealed in lead coffins can be preserved in analyzable condition for centuries. When King Richard III's lead coffin was opened in 2012, after 527 years, his body was still sufficiently preserved for comprehensive scientific analysis, including full DNA sequencing and detailed examination of wounds and bone structure. Elizabeth has been sealed for a shorter time in similar conditions, which means her remains almost certainly still exist in a state where modern DNA testing could definitively confirm or refute Androgen Insensitivity Syndrome in a matter of hours. Genetic analysis could answer 4 centuries of questions with scientific certainty. A simple DNA test would reveal whether she had XX or XY chromosomes, settling the fundamental question immediately. More detailed examination could identify whether she had the specific genetic mutations that cause AIS, could determine whether she had internal testes rather than ovaries, could map exactly what her anatomy looked like and why. The technology exists right now, today, to solve this historical mystery completely. Yet the tomb remains sealed, locked, protected by tradition and institutional authority that prevents any examination. The official position from Westminster Abbey and the British establishment is that disturbing royal tombs is disrespectful to the dead, that we should let Elizabeth rest in peace rather than satisfying modern curiosity about her private anatomy, that some mysteries should remain mysteries out of respect for historical figures who cannot consent to examination. But is it really about respect for the dead, or is it continued protection of institutional reputation and carefully constructed historical narratives that would be upended by confirmation of what those maids discovered? Think about what it would mean if modern DNA testing confirmed that Elizabeth I, arguably England's greatest monarch, had XY chromosomes. That the queen who defeated the Spanish Armada, who established the Protestant English Church, who created the Elizabethan Golden Age of literature and exploration, who ruled successfully for 44 years and is remembered as one of history's most capable leaders, was genetically male. It wouldn't change anything she accomplished. Her political genius, her diplomatic skill, her ability to navigate impossible situations and maintain England's independence and stability through decades of threats would remain exactly as impressive as they always were. But it would force a fundamental reconsideration of how we think about biological sex and gender in positions of power. Elizabeth proved that leadership ability, political intelligence, strategic thinking, and successful governance have nothing to do with chromosomes or reproductive anatomy. She ruled not as a woman or a man in any simple biological sense, but as something beyond those categories. Pure political genius in a body that made her survival a daily miracle. Someone who transcended the biological destiny that Tudor England would have used to disqualify her from power if they had known. The British establishment's reluctance to open that tomb and settle the question definitively suggests they understand the implications would be profound and uncomfortable. It's easier to maintain the official narrative of Elizabeth as a normal woman who simply chose not to marry than to confront the reality that England's greatest queen may have been genetically male, that her entire reign was built on concealing a biological truth that would have destroyed her if discovered. Some historians and scientists have petitioned Westminster Abbey for permission to examine Elizabeth's remains using modern forensic techniques that would be minimally invasive and completely respectful. DNA could be extracted from bone or teeth without significantly disturbing the coffin. Modern imaging technology could examine her skeletal structure without even opening the lead seal. These petitions have been consistently denied without detailed explanation, dismissed with vague appeals to respect and tradition that don't really explain why this particular historical mystery should remain unsolved when we've examined countless other historical figures' remains for far less significant questions. The question isn't whether Elizabeth was fit to rule. History answered that decisively with 44 years of successful, brilliant governance that established England as a major European power and created a cultural golden age that we still celebrate centuries later. The question is what her story tells us about the relationship between biology and ability, between body and mind, between the accidents of genetics and the capacity for greatness. Elizabeth faced an impossible biological situation. If she had Androgen Insensitivity Syndrome, as the evidence strongly suggests, she was living in a body that Tudor England had no framework to understand, no language to describe, no category to fit. She couldn't marry without discovery and execution, couldn't produce heirs, couldn't fulfill what everyone considered a queen's primary duty. Yet she ruled anyway and ruled magnificently. She survived by constructing elaborate defenses, by hiding in plain sight behind armor made of cosmetics and costumes, by carefully controlling what people could observe and from what distance, by silencing anyone who got close enough to see the truth. She turned what should have been disqualifying biological reality into irrelevance through sheer force of intelligence, political skill, and absolute determination to hold power despite a body that Tudor England would have used to deny her any authority at all. Maybe the real story here isn't about deception or fraud. It's about someone who transcended the biological destiny their genetics seemed to dictate, who refused to let chromosomes or anatomy determine their capability or limit their potential. Elizabeth proved that leadership has nothing to do with having a womb or XX chromosomes or any other biological marker that people use to categorize and limit each other. She proved that greatness comes from the mind, from intelligence and will and strategic brilliance, not from what lies between your legs. That's a truth that apparently remains too uncomfortable for the British establishment to acknowledge even 400 years later, which is why that lead coffin stays sealed and the mystery remains officially unsolved. But the evidence is there for anyone willing to look at it honestly. The confused ambassadors, the shocked doctor, the terrified maids, the systematic silencing, the desperate concealment that continued even after death. Elizabeth I was likely born with XY chromosomes in a world that would have killed her for it, and she became one of history's greatest monarchs anyway. That's not a scandal to hide. That's a triumph to celebrate. If you've made it this far, you need to understand something important. By subscribing to this channel right now, you're joining a community that refuses to accept sanitized, approved versions of history that protect powerful institutions instead of revealing truth. Hit that subscribe button because every video we release uncovers secrets that have been deliberately buried for centuries, mysteries that authorities would prefer stayed hidden forever. Leave a comment telling us whether you think Westminster Abbey should finally open Elizabeth's tomb and let modern DNA testing settle this question once and for all. Your engagement in the comments section helps YouTube's algorithm show this video to more people who deserve to know historical truths that have been concealed for over 400 years. And smash that like button if you believe it's time we stopped protecting royal reputations and started examining history with scientific honesty, because every like tells YouTube to push this content to truth seekers who are tired of being fed comfortable lies instead of uncomfortable facts. Subscribe, comment, and like right now, because the establishment won't reveal these secrets unless we force them into the light.